My wife brought her business partner into our ancestral estate. I stood in the foyer, looking at the wheelchair tracks on my family's hand-polished mahogany. Alyssa didn't apologize. She simply stated that Logan would be living with us indefinitely. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for a reason. I simply looked at the man occupying my legacy and spoke with a chilling neutrality. I've accepted a senior project in London, I said. I leave tonight. Alyssa froze. She never imagined I'd be this serene after seeing her desecrate our home. At that moment, would you have demanded an explanation for the betrayal, or would you have walked away quietly to let your countermove begin in the shadows? The house didn't smell like history anymore. Usually, the air in this estate carries the heavy, comforting scent of beeswax and ancient cedar, a sensory record of 6 generations of my family. Today, it was choked by the sharp clinical sting of antiseptic wipes. It was a hostile takeover of the senses. Looking back now, I realize I should have seen the structural decay long before Logan's wheelchair started marking the floors. But I had been the silent investor in Alyssa's version of reality, providing the capital of my talent while she managed the optics. I watched her adjust a cushion for him. There was no flicker of shame in her eyes, only the brisk, efficient entitlement of someone who had already decided I was a legacy asset to be liquidated. She looked at me, her gaze sliding over my power suit as if I were a stranger who had arrived early for a meeting. If I am being honest, I was a stranger. I had spent 5 years as a ghost, a silhouette in the blueprints of her success, and I had finally reached the limit of my credit. I started to wonder, at what point does a house stop being a home and start becoming a set for someone else's play? We were standing in a structure with no foundation. I had built the walls of her firm with my own hands, but she had invited the termites in. Logan sat there, his legs draped in a plaid blanket that looked curated for sympathy. He gave me a nod of forced camaraderie, a luxury he had overdrafted for years. I didn't return it. To me, he wasn't a guest. He was a symptom of a deeper rot. I walked past them toward my study. I didn't need a suitcase. I only needed one manila folder, the ledger of my real worth. Inside were the designs she claimed as her own, and a small digital recorder that had been a silent witness to their accounting. Alyssa followed me, her heels clicking on the mahogany. "You're being dramatic, Julian," she said, her voice thin. "London? On such short notice? We have the board audit in 2 days." I didn't turn around. I simply slid the folder into my bag. In the world of high-stakes restoration, you learn that some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating. She thought she was losing a husband. She didn't realize she was losing the only architect who knew how to keep her world from collapsing. I walked back to the foyer, my footsteps regular and slow. I didn't need to change the locks today. The locks don't matter when you're the one who owns the ground the house is built on. I caught a glimpse of Logan's gray medical flats near the door. Soft, sensible things that felt like a permanent stain on the wood. I adjusted my watch. It was exactly 4:15 p.m. I left without another word, the heavy oak door clicking shut with a finality that sounded like a balanced sheet. I wasn't just leaving a house, I was withdrawing my presence from a venture that had gone into emotional bankruptcy. I chose to step away temporarily, not because I lacked the right to evict them from my ancestral land, but to avoid a contested eviction that would alert them too early. I needed them to feel secure in their squandering so they would leave a clear trail of their financial and emotional betrayal. I was the ghost in every masterpiece she claimed. For 5 years, I sat in the dim light of my drafting table, translating my vision into her victory. People in the historic district still talk about the Savannah Heights restoration as if it were a divine intervention. They saw Alyssa on the local news, her hair perfect, accepting the preservation award. I was the one who spent 3 months mapping the structural integrity of those 19th century arches. I chose to stay in the shadows, believing I was shielding her from the deep-seated biases of the city's architectural elite. While my professional seal was on every technical permit filed at City Hall, making me the legally responsible architect of record, Alyssa ensured my name was scrubbed from every press release, award plaque, and client-facing contract. I was the foundation that held the structure up, invisible to the sun, but carrying the entire weight. I thought our marriage was a shared foundation. I didn't realize I was merely a contractor on a building I would never own. Sacrifice without respect isn't love. It's a slow form of self-erasure. At the time, I convinced myself that her success was mine by proxy. I'd watch her handle the heritage board with a charisma I never cared to cultivate, while I perfected the math that kept the walls standing. My gold-plated drafting compass, the tool I used to breathe life into the firm's most iconic projects, now sits on her desk. She uses it as a paperweight. It's a fitting metaphor. She saw the tool, but never the hand that guided it. To her, I was a utility, a subscription where I was the only one footing the bill for her lifestyle. Looking back now, I see that she never looked at the fine print of our professional existence. Arrogance has a way of blinding people to the systems that support them. Early on, I had established a copyright trust for my intellectual property. It was a tactical safeguard, a ledger of every line I ever drew. Alyssa didn't notice. She never truly saw me as her equal, so she never imagined I would be strategic enough to protect myself. She saw a husband who was content to be quiet. She didn't see an architect who was recording the rot. Even while I was checking into the hotel, my phone vibrated with a message from her. A technical error in the East Bay project. A structural discrepancy she couldn't explain to the client. She wanted me to clean it up before the board meeting. She was likely sitting across from Logan at that very moment, using the attention he gave her to ignore the fact that she was intellectually insolvent. It was the moment everything became clear. She didn't want a partner. She wanted a ghostwriter for a life she wasn't capable of leading. I left the message on read. The ghost was finally moving out. She believed I was at 30,000 feet over the Atlantic, bound for London. In reality, I was in a hotel 3 blocks away, watching the trap close through the digital lens of my own security system. To destroy a structure this rotten, I needed to be close enough to feel the vibration when the first wall fell. In the sterile silence of my hotel room, the only sound was the rhythmic tapping of my keyboard, a clinical counterpoint to the chaotic secrets I was unearthing. Looking back now, I realize how much the human mind will ignore just to preserve its comfort. While I had been meticulously restoring Savannah's history, Logan had been meticulously dismantling my future. He had left a digital trail on our home network, a series of open files that acted as a confession he never intended to make. The first entry in his ledger was a claim for $1,500,000 in insurance payouts. He was faking the severity of his paralysis, performing a role of brokenness to secure a massive windfall. But that was only the surface of the rot. As I dug deeper into the firm's financial footprints, I discovered that the parasite was already consuming the facade. I realized Alyssa had signed a limited power of attorney, granting Logan control over her secondary operating accounts under the pretense of easing her administrative burden. She thought she was being a benevolent partner. In reality, she had handed the fox the keys to the henhouse. Logan had been secretly redirecting Alyssa's profit margins into an offshore account, siphoning the very capital my ghost designs had generated. If I am being honest, it was a strangely efficient bit of accounting. He was robbing a woman who was already busy robbing her husband. It took me hours to map the full extent of the siphoning. The most dangerous predators aren't the ones who hunt you. They're the ones who convince you they need your protection. Alyssa believed she was Logan's savior, a role that allowed her to feel powerful while she treated me like a liability. She couldn't see that her own firm was trending toward emotional and financial bankruptcy. Every accident he had, every wheelchair squeak on my mahogany floors was just another transaction in his long con. At the time, I felt a sharp impulse to call the police, to end the charade right then. But I faced a massive point of friction. To report Logan's insurance fraud, I would have to reveal the firm's internal records that contained 5 years of my own uncredited work. If I exposed him now, I would expose the fact that Alyssa's award-winning portfolio was a fabrication. It would complicate my standing with the Savannah Heritage Board and jeopardize the surgical extraction I was planning. I had to stay patient. In restoration, you never tear down a load-bearing wall until you've secured the temporary shoring. The blue light of the monitor reflected in my glasses as the clock hit 11:51 p.m. I watched a grainy security feed from our living room, a recording captured by the integrated home security system, a suite of sensors Alyssa had dismissed as non-functional after I failed to repair them months ago. In my own house, I was the only one who knew the blind spots had been eliminated. In the footage, Logan stood up from his wheelchair to pour himself a glass of my family's 20-year-old scotch, moving with an agility that mocked his plaid blanket. He looked at the camera he didn't know I had installed, and smirked. I saved the file. My phone buzzed with a final notification for the evening. The Savannah Heritage Board audit was officially confirmed for 9 a.m. the following day. The shoring was in place. Tomorrow, I would remove the walls. Integrity is the only structural element that cannot be faked. At precisely 9 o'clock the next morning, I walked into the Savannah Heritage Board's headquarters, a building that felt more like a cathedral dedicated to the preservation of truth. The office of the chairman, Samuel, was lined with heavy brass-bound ledgers and the original ink-on-vellum plans of this city. It was an environment that demanded accountability, a stark contrast to the hollow, image-obsessed firm Alyssa had built on the shifting sands of my labor. I didn't arrive as a husband seeking sympathy. I arrived as a technical consultant delivering an audit. I handed Samuel a dossier that detailed the structural rot in the firm's 3 most recent high-profile projects. These weren't just clerical errors. They were fundamental engineering failures that Alyssa had ignored because she lacked the technical capacity to understand the blueprints I had provided. Looking back now, I realize that legacy isn't just wood and stone. It's the integrity behind the hand that drew the plans. Alyssa had been selling the aesthetics of history while bypassing the ethics of its preservation. Samuel studied the reports in silence, his weathered fingers tracing the discrepancies I had highlighted. He was a man who lived by the standard of his ancestors, and I could see the disappointment forming in the lines of his face. It wasn't a meeting. It was a handover of liability. I presented myself as an anonymous expert, a man who had been cleaning up the firm's technical debt from the shadows. I watched as he compared my provided portfolio to the official filings Alyssa had submitted. The shift in the room's pressure was palpable. For the first time in 5 years, the power was no longer in the hands of the person who spoke the loudest, but in the hands of the person who held the data. "These calculations are exceptional, Julian," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of a final judgment. He looked at me, really looked at me, as a peer for the first time. It takes a rare mind to see the invisible stress points in a structure before they cause a collapse. It was a micro payoff. I hadn't expected the simple clinical recognition of my worth by a man who actually understood the craft. If I am being honest, it felt more satisfying than any of the trophies Alyssa had displayed on her mantle. I stayed professional, my tone as measured as a spirit level. I informed him that the firm was intellectually insolvent, and that a deeper financial audit would likely reveal that the rot extended into their operating accounts. I didn't mention Logan. I didn't mention the betrayal in my bedroom. I kept the conversation focused on the preservation of the city's architectural standards. I knew that in a place like Savannah, you don't need to burn a house down to destroy its value. You just have to prove that its foundation is a lie. As I stood to leave, Samuel closed the brass-bound ledger on his desk. The sound echoed through the room like a gavel. He leaned back, his eyes sharp and inquisitive. "One thing puzzles me, Julian," he said. "With a talent this refined, why have we never heard your name before?" I paused at the door, my hand on the cold iron handle. "I was waiting for the right foundation," I replied. I left him with that question hanging in the air, knowing that by 9 a.m. tomorrow, the answer would be public record. Performance art is a form of survival for some. I stood in the quiet hallway outside the grand boardroom, the silence of the polished marble echoing my own clinical stillness. Through the gap in the heavy oak doors, I watched the scene unfold. Alyssa was in her element, her voice modulated to a perfect pitch of professional concern and personal tragedy. She was introducing Logan to the board, positioning his wheelchair, that prop of supposed brokenness, at the center of the room. She was using him as a shield, a sympathetic explanation for the delays and errors I had deliberately left in the files. She thought she was being a visionary leader protecting a wounded partner. She didn't realize she was just a performer on a stage that was about to be dismantled. If I am being honest, I felt a detached sort of pity watching her. She was suffering from the illusory pedestal of borrowed genius. When a partner builds their identity on someone else's talent, they develop a psychological blind spot. They start to believe that they are the source of the light rather than just the mirror reflecting it. Alyssa resents me because my very existence is a reminder that she is intellectually insolvent. She moved Logan into our home not just for love, but as an attempt to kill the creator. She wanted a world where she didn't have to look at the man who actually drew the lines she claimed to own. But the irony was thicker than the lacquer on the boardroom table. As I watched Logan the parasite dabbing his eyes with a plaid handkerchief, the full scope of the double con became undeniable. Logan didn't target Alyssa because he loved her. He targeted her because she had access to me. He is a professional predator who recognized a facade when he saw one. He knew she was a facade CEO who couldn't check her own accounts, and he had been siphoning her operating capital while she was busy erasing my name. She was walking into a trap she had helped build, fueled by her own narcissism and need for validation. It's a strange thing to watch the woman you loved walk into a trap she set for herself. Looking back now, I see that some things don't break all at once. They rot from within a slow-moving structural failure that remains invisible until the load-bearing walls are stressed. Alyssa had removed the only load-bearing element in her life, the ghost, who kept her honest. Now, the roof was beginning to sag. She was leaning over Logan, whispering, something meant to look intimate for the benefit of the auditors. The sound of the wheelchair wheels squeaking across the floor felt like a warning, a high-pitched signal of the deception she was too blind to see. I checked my watch. It was exactly 9 o'clock a.m. I adjusted the knot of my silk tie and stepped back from the door. Inside, the room fell silent as Samuel prepared to open the session. The air was taut, pulled tight like a bowstring. "Begin the presentation, Mrs. Brooks," I heard Samuel say. His voice was cold, stripped of its usual southern politeness. I took a slow breath, my heart beat steady at 60 beats per minute. The shoring was secure. It was time to pull the trigger. The first line of her masterpiece was a lie. I stood at the back of the room, watching Alyssa project my architectural renderings onto the screen. She spoke of sacred geometry and structural honesty as if she had been the one to spend 100 nights at the drafting table verifying the load-bearing capacities of the North Wing. It was a flawless performance, a subscription to a reality where her charisma was the only currency required to buy a legacy. Looking back now, it was like watching a child play with a high-voltage wire. The arrogance of ignorance is a dangerous thing. She was so convinced of her own narrative that she didn't even notice Samuel's eyes weren't on the screen, they were on her. I walked toward the table as she reached the climax of her presentation. The room went silent. The measured sound of my footsteps on the hardwood was the only noise, a rhythmic counting of her remaining minutes. As a professional, Alyssa's face shifted from triumph to a familiar cold annoyance. "Julian," she said, her voice a sharp whisper that didn't quite carry to the board members, "this is an executive session. Get out." She still thought I was the silent partner who existed only to fix her technical errors. She didn't realize that in high-stakes restoration, you never hand over the final plans until the payment has cleared. And her emotional and professional account was currently overdrawn. Samuel didn't let her continue. He didn't even look at the renderings. "Sit down, Mrs. Brooks," he said, and for the first time, his voice held the absolute finality of a gavel striking the bench. He gestured toward me with a slow, deliberate movement. "This is Julian Brooks. He isn't here as your employee. He is the independent technical auditor appointed by this board to oversee your firm's compliance, and as of 7:30 this morning, he is the registered copyright holder of every single design you just presented. The board has waived the standard conflict of interest protocols because Mr. Brooks is the sole creator of the intellectual property your firm is using. Legally, the Heritage Board cannot certify any project that doesn't carry his verified signature, making his audit a legal necessity, not a personal choice." The oxygen seemed to leave the room in a single, collective gasp. Alyssa's phone clattered onto the table, the same phone she had used to text me for favors while she sat in my ancestral home with another man. This wasn't a confrontation, it was a clinical extraction of the rot she had invited in. I opened the manila folder and activated the small digital pen I had carried for months. The recording echoed through the high ceilings. It wasn't my voice. It was Logan's clear and agile, discussing how he would drain the architect dry once the $1,500,000 insurance claim was finalized. The sound was a scalpel, slicing through the layers of their deception. In that moment, I realized that some things don't break all at once. They rot from within until the first touch of truth brings the whole structure down. Logan, who had been sitting in the center of the room like a tragic monument to his own lies, suddenly jerked in his wheelchair. The fear was the only real thing left about him. The mention of a federal forensic audit shattered his composure. Panicked by the invisible net closing in and the threat of immediate indictment, his animal instinct for self-preservation overrode his years of calculated performance. He forgot the wheelchair. He forgot the plaid blanket. He stood up from his chair to reach for my folder, a reflex that lasted only 2 seconds, but was more devastating than any legal document I could have filed. He stood there, balanced perfectly on his paralyzed legs, while the board members watched in a horrifying, frozen clarity. He had faked a tragedy to inhabit my house, and Alyssa had helped him build the set. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to see the wreckage of her expression. I simply looked at Samuel and nodded. The audit was over. The accounting was finally complete. Truth has a way of finishing the job. The dust in Savannah settled much faster than I anticipated. Once the Heritage Board released the findings of the audit, the high society circles that once worshipped Alyssa's borrowed charisma went strangely silent. I didn't stay to watch the theater of her professional collapse. An architect knows that once the structural integrity of a life is proven to be a lie, the house is already gone. Alyssa's firm was stripped of its license within 3 weeks. She currently faces years of civil litigation from clients who realized their masterpieces were built on ethical rot. Looking back now, I realize that some people believe revenge is a wrecking ball. They think it needs to be loud, chaotic, and destructive. But I've learned that real justice is actually a form of restoration. It is the process of removing the layers of decay to see what is actually worth saving. Sacrifice without respect is never a sound investment. It is merely a slow form of self-erasure. I had spent 5 years being the ghost in her machine, believing that my silence was a proof of my love. If I am being honest, it was just a subscription to my own diminishing returns. Logan's fate was decided by the very systems he tried to exploit. He was indicted on multiple federal counts, including wire fraud and a massive insurance scam. The evidence from my hidden recorder and the financial audit made the case bulletproof. The man who thought he could inhabit my heritage while faking a tragedy found himself in a sterile cell where the only thing he has to navigate is his own regret. Alyssa is left to rebuild from the wreckage of her own mediocrity. She is no longer a CEO. She is a cautionary tale in an industry that prizes integrity above all else. I hear she tried to sell the firm's remaining assets, only to find that without my designs, she was holding a ledger full of empty promises. Today, I work in a modest studio in a quiet, sun-drenched part of the city. My name is finally on my own door. It isn't a massive corporate sign, just a simple brass plate that represents my right to be seen as the creator of my own life. I am currently restoring a small, broken 19th century church on the outskirts of Savannah. It is humble, honest work. Every joint I carve and every stone I set is an act of truth. There is a profound peace in knowing that the architecture of my soul no longer requires a facade. It took me years to understand that being independent and self-sufficient is often used as a justification by others to neglect you. They call you strong because it relieves them of the obligation to be kind. If you are someone who has spent your life providing the foundation for others while they took all the credit, I want you to know that your silence isn't a lack of vision. It is a dormant power. You do not need anyone's permission to celebrate your own worth. I've learned that the best revenge isn't the destruction of your enemies. It is becoming so successful, so peaceful, and so free that their opinion of you no longer carries any weight. It is the moment you look at the quiet emptiness of your own home and realize you aren't lonely, you are finally in good company. The termites are gone, the rot has been removed, and the shoring is no longer necessary. I am the architect of my own peace now. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever been the one left in the shadows while someone else took the credit for your heart, I would really like to hear your perspective. Have you ever had to find the courage to walk away from a structure that was no longer safe for your soul? What was the first stone you laid for your new foundation?